Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Pileckiego Institute here. Today, we're going to be talking about the Soviet invasion of Poland on the 17th of September 1939. I have with me today Professor Evan Mawdsley, who is a former professor of international history at the University of Glasgow. He's a historian and author, and he's written many books like Thunder in the East, the Nazi-Soviet War 1941 to 1945, and World War II, A New History. Welcome, Professor.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Do you know what? I think we should just jump straight into the subject because it's a subject that not so many people know about. So like I literally just mentioned moments ago, the Germans invade Poland on the 1st of September 39, then the Soviets literally 17 days later. So can you talk us through what the invasion looked like? So was it a surprise for the Poles?
The Soviet invasion or the German invasion? I think in a way both of them were probably a surprise for the Poles. All of this develops really fast in the summer of 1939, and I think no one knows quite what to expect. And it's awfully hard to see it from hindsight and try to explain why the Polish government did this or did that. But certainly the things happen quickly. There's a pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, which is ostensibly a non-aggression pact, but in fact also includes secret protocols by which they will divide Poland into two spheres of influence, roughly on the Vistula River. And that is the kind of the first development, the first sudden development. And then Germany invades Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Again, we all more or less know that. We probably more know that Britain put forward an ultimatum asking Germany to withdraw. And then on the 3rd of September, Britain declared war. And a lot of people see that as the beginning of the Second World War. I wouldn't see it that way, but some people do. Anyway, that's probably most people do. Anyway, and then we know roughly about the invasion of Poland when it happens. There are lots of myths about that. And probably the most famous is Polish cavalrymen charging German tanks on their horses and so on with their lances, which is not really which is a myth. The idea that the Polish Air Force was destroyed on the ground, again, that's not true. The Poles do fight very, very valiantly in the campaign, and it's kind of a forgotten campaign. But for the Germans, it was really quite a difficult one. Altogether, the Germans lost 16,000 men killed in the war against Poland. The Poles lost a lot more, about 60,000. But if you compare the campaign in Poland to what happened, say, in Yugoslavia or Greece, or even the beginnings of the campaign in France, the Polish campaign was more costly. The fighting was harder, much harder than elsewhere. Certainly much harder than say Yugoslavia, where a couple of dozen Yugoslav troops were killed, literally, and in 1941, and Poland, where 16,000 were. So it was a valiant campaign, and while this was going on. While the Polish campaign was going on the 17th of September, the Soviet Union sent troops into the eastern part of the country. Again, not everyone would know that, but that certainly does happen. So that's the kind of overall picture. On the kind of looking at the fighting and what things were actually like, the problem I think was that the Poles did not expect a war on quite the horrific scale which actually was unleashed by the Germans, let alone the later occupation of the eastern part of the country. The Poles had mostly set their army up quite close along the western border of Poland and western and northern borders of Poland, facing Germany and facing East Prussia. And they were there because they didn't want a German attack which would gain some territory, but and the Germans would say get the Danzig corridor between East Prussia and the rest of Germany, or they might get areas in Silesia, and in a kind of fait accompli, kind of like Czechoslovakia, they would force the Poles to accept that. So that's why the Polish army was deployed to fight where it, right on the border. And unfortunately, in military terms, that was disastrous because they were encircled near the border by very fast-moving German troops. There was no kind of depth in the Polish defense. They didn't expect to have to fight in the east as well, but they could have been deployed in a situation where the war could have lasted longer. And in fact, it only lasts a month, which I think surprised a lot of European states. Certainly, the way that the war progressed, in effect, the Polish army being beaten in about 3 weeks, made Western intervention impossible. And it also meant that by the time the Soviet Union occupied the eastern part of the country, the Polish army had ceased to function as an effective force. So the Warsaw was still being defended, but the nature of the conflict had changed. The Poles hadn't expected a Soviet invasion either. I think they might have expected an aggression by Germany, but they had not thought that the Russians were going to act. Although the Russians and Poles had a long-lasting hostility going back at least to 1920, and actually well before that. So when the Russians entered, there was less of the kind of fighting that there had been in the east. There was less of the fighting than there had been in the west, because by that time the Polish army was largely out of commission. So the Russians did advance pretty rapidly across eastern Poland, and by the end of September, beginning of October, the fighting had largely ceased. Whether in a military sense you can call what the Russians did an invasion, it was the same kind of invasion as the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. It was an invasion of a country that had largely already been defeated and had relatively few troops deployed in the east. But in any event, that does happen, and the end result, by the end of September, beginning of October, is that the country is occupied by two enemy states, totalitarian enemy states, and is subject to a fierce occupation policy by both of them.
Do you know, it's very interesting. My great-grandfather writes in his diary when the invasion does happen by the Soviets. He says, "I can't believe this. Is this literally a joke?" He actually thought that it was a joke that the Soviets invaded. I mean, how is it possible that Poles are now going to literally have to fight on two fronts, from the east and from the west? It's just mind-blowing.
I know. I think, and one reason why people think that is because, or thought that, and I'm sure your grandfather was quite right, was because, in the 1930s, the great enemies were the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. They were, it was like the Cold War. They were the two powers which, in terms of history and politics, were most opposed to one another. And if it hadn't been for the week before the war and the Nazi-Soviet Pact, what was happening would have been even more unbelievable.
I mean, we're looking at unbelievable numbers at this stage, statistic-wise, because the Polish army is not just outnumbered by the Germans, but they're now being outnumbered completely by the Soviets. I mean, double, triple, quadruple the amount of troops they've got. Poland's army is literally split at this point, isn't it?
Well, yes, I say, but most of the Polish army was in the west, and by the time we're talking about, a lot of them had a lot of the Polish leadership and a lot of forces were withdrawing into Romania. But yeah, I mean, they certainly hadn't expected to fight on both fronts, and that was an impossible task. On the whole, for example, the French, who were close allies of the Poles, had argued that the Poles should deploy further east. That they should actually try to fight a longer war, holding the central part of Poland around Warsaw, and then withdrawing back into the depths of eastern Poland. But of course, that would have been impossible anyway because of the Soviet occupation of the eastern part of the country. So it's that's what really happens. What's complicating, I think, and again, I think people who don't know much about this would find it complicating, is that the Polish state from 1920 to 1940 was it wasn't what happened later on. The Polish state is now geographically somewhere quite different from what it was like in 1940, and the large part of eastern Poland both Poland and Eastern Poland had been part of Russia before 1914, mostly. But Eastern Poland had large non-Polish minorities, Jews, Belarusians, of course, that's very, very relevant to now, Belarus, and Ukrainians. And the Soviets could claim that these were oppressed minorities, that the Belarusians and Ukrainians in the eastern part of Poland were being dominated by a Polish minority. At least that was an excuse that could be made, and which later on the Allies used to kind of justify a fundamental border change. Because what actually happens is that the border, which Hitler and Stalin eventually agree upon, is the border which Poland ends up in with after Yalta in 1945. In a way that what happens in 1939 is never undone. And in fact, Belarus and Ukraine, as they now exist, includes large chunks of what had been Poland before 1939.
You just mentioned Belarus, and I'm actually right now, I'm in our Berlin branch of the Pileckiego Institute, and I'm sitting in the Belarus exhibition, and behind me is obviously one of the posters, and people know, they should know what's happening in Belarus at the moment, because literally, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Lukashenko again is starting to use this propaganda that you've literally just outlined for us. I've got a quote. I'm going to read this quote because he says, this day, the 17th of September, so he's referring to the invasion of Poland by the Soviets, it became an act of historical justice for the Belarusian nation. I mean, he's using such propaganda to portray Poland as a fascist nation then and a fascist nation now.
Yeah,
and
that's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah. Although
I just wanted to throw in that is Lukashenko and Putin is not far behind him either.
No. By the way, could you explain to people what peremen means, which is on the poster behind you? I mean, they're all probably thinking, what does peremen mean? As am I. Does it relate to the events or what?
It's if I'm not mistaken, I think it means freedom. I may be completely and utterly mistaken, but it's to do with the freedom of the Russian people, the Belarusian people, sorry. What I'll do in a moment, when we do finish, for the people that are listening now, because obviously we're having a discussion about the invasion of Poland, I've got to my right-hand side some absolutely phenomenal photographs of what's happening during the marches of freedom and the oppression and things that are happening in Belarus right now. So I would highly recommend, if anybody is in Berlin, to be able to come to this exhibition. And I think it is actually going to go traveling around, I think, Germany and hopefully at some stage in places around the world. So it is an absolutely incredible exhibition, the one that I'm sitting at right now.
Yeah, I'm totally, supportive of the Belarusian opposition. I mean, absolutely no doubt about that. And for a democratic Belarus and a democratic Ukraine, I think both of those are really important outcomes that we should hope for, and getting rid certainly of the present government in Belarus. But the fact remains that the eastern part of Poland did have minority populations, and they were what we would call Belarusians, what we would call Ukrainians, and that is a factor in the background, which is important both in 1939, but also in 1945 and thereafter. But that kind of partly explains the dynamic of this. I should really mention the Curzon line here, because it's something which is kind of fundamental to the understanding. Was that in 1920 Russia and Poland fought a war which the British mediated. Lord Curzon, who was the foreign secretary at the time, was the person who kind of laid out the solution, and the demarcation line between the Soviet Russia and the newly independent Poland was this line called the Curzon line. But for various reasons, without going into the history of that war, the Curzon line did include behind it, to the east of it, large, what was it, mixed population. But for example, some of the towns had Polish population. Most of the countryside was either Belarusian or Ukrainian. So it was a kind of, this was not a new story, right? It's this idea about Poland having ethnic minorities in the east I think is a relevant one.
Okay, so I think we should stick to the subject about civilians. We'll come back to the military in just a moment, because once the Soviet occupation began, what actually happens to the Polish civilians at this point?
Yes, well, both in the German occupied zone and the Russian occupied zone, a lot of atrocities are take place. I mean, I've seen figures for the number of deaths in the Soviet part of Poland being 500,000, which is, you know, an absolutely terrible amount, because rather more probably than were killed in the German part of Poland at this time, before the Holocaust which was involved the liquidation of most of the Jewish population of Poland. But certainly in both cases there was internment of hostile elements. The Nazis executed Polish intellectuals in Krakow and elsewhere. There was an arrest of class enemies in the Soviet zone. The most famous example of that, of course, is the arrest of Polish military and police officers who were taken to the Soviet Union in 3 concentration camp sites, of which the best known is Katyn, and they were all literally shot in the back of the head by the Soviet secret police. So and there was also a lot of movement back and forth of Belarusians and Ukrainians out of what was now the German zone into what was now the Soviet zone, and at the same time Germans and Poles from the Soviet held area into the German held one. So it was a time of great turmoil. It was a time of atrocities on both sides, and frankly, I probably wouldn't see that much difference between the two. I mean, they're both totalitarian states. They're both totalitarian police states, and they both used terrible force against their populations.
I find it very interesting. I'm going to refer to Lvov only because I know the most about what happened in Lvov. My great-grandfather was the one who negotiated with Khrushchev and the Soviets for the not the release, but for the prisoners of war that were being taken into captivity. And nobody at this point in 1939 was expecting that they were going to literally a few months later take 22,000 officers, doctors, basically the intellectual class, and execute 22,000 of them in a forest. Obviously within stages, you know, it's a little bit more complicated that, but at this point nobody knows they're negotiating for the Geneva Convention, and it's just not happening. Yeah, I think it's mind-blowing.
I think that's right. I mean, that's really quite astute, I think, because nobody expected, as you say, this kind of atrocity on either side. You know, the war had developed. You know, in some ways, it had echoes of the later war. I mean, there are Einsatzgruppen, SS death squads in Western Poland during, you know, as part of the war, but the kind of total war which emerges later on really was hard to anticipate. On the other hand, I mean, this sounds, I'm not being facetious about this at all, but what happens to the Poles is only part of Stalinist terror in the late 1930s and early 40s. And so 22,000 Polish officers is not very many compared to the number of Red Army officers who were killed in 1937 and 1938, or Koreans or other minorities who were deported in 1940. This kind of mass operation was what the Soviet NKVD was practicing at this time, primarily on Russians. You know, I mean, a lot more Russians were killed. Soviet citizens were killed than Poles. So I think again, that's kind of the context that you have to see it in. You know, it wasn't. I mean, the kind of measure that was taken, this mass operation at Katyn, was foreshadowed by earlier mass operations on Russian territory and elsewhere on the Russian border. But the fact that there was a precedent doesn't make it in any way excusable.
So at the moment, as we touched on very briefly, it's to do with propaganda and things like that. So at the moment, should we blame just the Germans, because this is what the new narrative is now coming into, just the Germans for starting World War II? Or should we include the Soviets in this too, because they were just as complicit?
Yeah, I don't want to flog a dead horse here, but my view is that World War II began in July 1937, and it began in China, between Japan and China. That's kind of one of the arguments of my World War II and your history. But if you look at the European side of it, I can see where you're getting at. I think that in terms of the immediate events, the war in Poland is entirely a German enterprise. The Germans would have invaded Poland even if they hadn't signed a pact with the Soviet Union. So in terms of this is my view, and it's probably, I mean, there are people who disagree with this, but I think most people would probably say that Hitler was very eager to destroy the Polish state and to gain control over Eastern Europe, over Central and Eastern Europe. And he, as we know, he planned a military campaign in Poland. Some of his senior generals resigned because of it. He thought that this could be achieved just as the destruction of Czechoslovakia could be achieved without the intervention of the other great powers. This would not involve, it wouldn't involve the United States, which wasn't at that time a European power. It wouldn't have involved Britain or France. They would back down after a German invasion, just as they had backed down under the series of other advances made by the Germans in the late 1930s, notably over Czechoslovakia at Munich. So if you want to say whose initiative is it, then I would say it is a German initiative. I would argue also that the fact that the Soviets occupied the eastern part of Poland, which strictly speaking is an invasion, didn't affect the outcome. In either event, Poland would have been weakened militarily, and either the whole country or just the western part of the country would be occupied by the Germans. People who defend Russian policy, and I'm not one of them in this case, would take the line that, well, the Russians acted because if they didn't, that the Germans would occupy all of Poland, including the eastern part. And it's worth bearing in mind that the 17th of September is in the same month as the 1st, but it's 3 weeks later. But the Russians don't act until effectively the German army has eliminated most forms of resistance. So, I mean, what is different is that the Soviets do occupy the eastern part of Poland, absolutely. But I wouldn't say that they were responsible for the destruction of the Polish state or the defeat of the Polish army or the beginning of the war in Poland. I think those things are the responsibility of the Germans.
I find that very interesting. It's a very interesting point of view. But at the end of the day, I'm still going to underline this. Both of them were totalitarian states. Both of them did.
Absolutely. No, I'm not denying that. And certainly, I'm also, your question was, who set it off, yeah. Right? My answer is the Germans set it off. I'm not saying, if you say whose policy was worse between 1939 and 1941, yeah, I probably agree with you. And what were the events that occurred on the 17th of September 1939, was that a terrible event? Yes, it was. I'm not denying that. This is happening, of course, elsewhere in Europe. Shortly after this happens, the Germans declare war in Finland. The Soviets declare war in Finland. They occupy and then they annex Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They occupy part of Romania. So yes, they are. Soviet policy is like German policy. aggressive. And in a way, one of the things that maybe one should bear in mind is that there's a kind of similar route to that, in that both the Soviets, the Russians, and the Germans are kind of undoing the events of the First World War. If you look at it kind of historically, and not even bringing in politics, one could bring in racism and radical socialism, but I think even in terms of the actual history of the thing, what happens in 1918 is that Germany loses its eastern possessions, okay, which includes much of Poland, at least the western part of Poland, and you could argue that Austria-Hungary is divided up and ceases to be a German-dominated area. So there is an extent to which what the Germans are doing under Hitler is revisionist. They're trying to wind the clock back 20 years and to get Germany back in the position which they see as rightful. This isn't just Hitler. This is also the army, the upper middle class, and so on. All think that, right? So that's understandable. Same thing is true in Russia. Russia in 1914, even 1917, it controlled Finland, it controlled the Baltic states, it controlled most of Poland, it controlled much of part of Romania. All those things were lost in 1918, 1919, 1920 during the Civil War. And the argument which the Russians made, and which Russian nationalists probably still make today, is that they were just restoring what had been lost in 1920. So if you're looking for kind of equalities or similarities, then I would say that that they're certainly there. I'm not defending Soviet policy at all, but I'm just saying that you're looking at it objectively. The Poles are kind of the victims of being in the middle of these events. What's striking is really the position that Poland was in say 1939. What can Poland do? It's got hostile states on either side. It's distant from any potential allies. I mean, the French had been allies, but there wasn't an awful lot the French could do. The Poles had probably overextended themselves in 1920 when they occupied territory to the east of the Curzon line, and the problem with that was it kind of soured forever relations with the Russians. The Poles really had to get either the Russians or the Germans on their side if they were going to survive. And unfortunately, in 1939, both the totalitarian states, and again they were totalitarian states, both of those states at the same time to partition Poland, just as Poland had been partitioned in the 18th century.
I mean, in every talk, anybody ever really does at this point, and they ask about remembrance, commemoration, and things. And I don't want to get too much into politics because we could sit here all day talking about what's currently going on and propaganda and things like that. But how, in your opinion, do you think the Soviet invasion is remembered around the world? Of Poland, obviously.
Well, it's obviously remembered in Poland in September 1939. That invasion. Yeah, I don't think that if you look around the outside Poland or even inside Russia, that it's not remembered in that way. I mean, certainly the Russian propaganda line was that we invaded eastern Poland for our own national defense and to liberate the Belarusians and Ukrainians. I mean, that sounds ironic today, but that's what they would say. And I don't think other people would be aware that when Hitler invades, and Hitler does begin the invasion. That's how people remember it. And Britain goes to war not because Russia occupies eastern Poland, but because Germany attacks western Poland. In fact, the Russian government the British government made the argument that although Britain had guaranteed Poland against foreign invasion, the terms of Britain's guarantee were against an invasion by a European state. And their argument was that Russia wasn't a European state, therefore there wasn't a guarantee. But a lot of this is kind of, I'm not kind of avoiding your question, but in terms of kind of realpolitik, from the if you kind of start from a position of being really, really worried about Germany, and the Allies certainly were, then you're looking for whatever help you can get. And so ultimately, the war does take the shape that it does. The Russians do play the role that they do play. Probably the Allies couldn't have beaten Hitler without Russian help. All of those things are really unpleasant. and it means going to bed with really awful people, but the war does end with an Allied victory. So if you kind of say, well, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, the Poles are the victims of that. They're the ones in the middle. So to answer your question directly, I don't think a lot of people outside Poland would be aware of the Russian invasion or the Russian occupation of Eastern Poland on the 17th of September.
I can underline that for a fact, because many people just they remember the first and they completely forget about the 17th. But in Poland, we commemorate and we will always remember.
Yeah. Do you feel? I mean, this is a slightly different question, but you did mention Belarus and the Russian exhibition. Do you sense a current hostility between Belarus and Poland? I don't mean just at the official level, but is there still a kind of sense of antagonism in the same way, for example, between England and Ireland, that kind of tension? Is that still there, or is that gone? I'm sure the Poles sympathize with the Belarusian opposition. I mean, I'm sure that's true, but I just wondered whether you feel there's not a complete sympathy between the two.
At the moment, Poland is fully in support from everyone I speak to, from the government to low down, us normal random people. Everybody's in support of this. This should not, we are in the 21st century. This should not be happening in a 21st, developed society. That's it. That's the bottom line. Poland is in support. I mean, we've been taking in athletes and refugees and people fleeing political persecution. It's the way it is. One hand holds the next.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm totally sympathetic to that. I mean, from the Russian point of view, if I can, and I'm not sympathetic at all with Putin. I mean, totally not. But the Russian view kind of is sort of, well, we have to protect our borders and we have to extend our influence over parts of Europe, which probably doesn't mean we want to annex Belarus or want to annex Ukraine. In fact, what's remarkable is that if anything, Russian policy has antagonized the populations of those places. But in a kind of ideal sense, the Russians would like to think that there was a kind of a buffer for them from the outside West in the form of Belarus and Ukraine. So this kind of near abroad for them is an area they want to have influence in. They don't want hostile elements there, but it's very hard for Putin, as it was for Stalin, to control those areas and keeping the support of the population. And this kind of relates to another point I'd like to kind of finish with, which is that, there is this underlying tension between Russia and Poland, which goes back a very long way. It goes back, I mean, in the 16th century, the Poles occupy Moscow. Poles are Catholic, Russians are Orthodox. This Poland is kind of on the approach roads to Russia and so on. So if you're kind of paranoid in Russia, then Poland is something which you worry about. Poles, there's a war between Poland and Russia in 1920, which I would kind of argue the Poles started. I'm not, that's a strong thing to say, but certainly it began with a Polish occupation of Western Ukraine. So there's history there. I mean that's part of the underlying reality which occurs in 1939. Now, you'd imagine that fellow Slavs, Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Russians would have a common kind of Slavophile unity where they would be opposed to something like Nazi Germany. But the way that history in the region works out, there are a lot of tensions which you can't sweep under the carpet.
Professor, this has been absolutely so enlightening and a fascinating conversation I've been able to have with you. Thank you so much for joining me today and being able to talk about this.
I hope it was some help. I mean, I'm not trying to in any way defend Soviet policy, and I'm certainly not, I want to stress this, minimizing the importance of the 17th of September as the date in which the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Poland. I think it's a date which people should not forget about.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.